Hello and welcome to Autology, the weekly podcast that brings you the latest on automotive technology. I'm Rebecca Bell-Chambers, and this week's episode is called EVS35, Checking the Industry Pulse in the EV Heartland. Here with me is today's guest, Graham Evans, Research Director of E-Mobility Component Research within S&P Global Mobility Supply Chain Technology and Aftermarket Group. Hello, and thank you for joining this week's episode of Autology.
Thanks, Rebecca. Great to be here from a very hot London.
So this week's podcast is all about last week's electric vehicle symposium held in Norway's capital city of Oslo. Entitled EVS35, this was the 35th year that the event has been held, first coming in 1969, held in Phoenix, Arizona. So Graham, to start with, could you tell us a little bit about the scope and the remit of the EVS35 as a conference?
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to. Yeah, so the EVS conference series is, I guess, one of the leading electric vehicle conferences globally. It's organised by AVERA, the European Association of Electromobility, this year, in conjunction with the the Norwegian Electric Vehicle Association, so held in Oslo. The conference rotates each year between the major regions globally, between Asia, Americas, and Europe. And the venue itself is a place called Nova Spectrum, which is in Lillestrøm, just outside of Oslo city centre. So, I mean, as an exhibition, pretty big, over 150 exhibitors in the exhibition hall. And then accompanying this is a conference, a quite technical conference with a kind of large academic presence. As well as this, there was a number of ride and drive opportunities, so the opportunity to experience not just like passenger vehicle EVs, but also buses, smaller stuff like e-scooters, etc. And just a chance to really kind of get a feeling for the technology itself. And then I think it's very specific to this year's event in Oslo. There was also a city tour, the opportunity to go around some of the key EV sites in Oslo. So some of the electric vehicle charging depots for some of the public transport. Also the opportunity to see the wireless charging pilot that's been provided by the company Momentum Dynamics. And then obviously with a lot of these events, also the opportunity, a number of networking events, one at the City Hall where the Nobel Prize is given out. So that was quite interesting to see. And a number of kind of dinners and other associated network events. So yeah, pretty all-encompassing events and well attended.
Okay, great. That sounds like quite the event. So what were some of the key themes of the conference that you saw?
Yeah, great. So I'm obviously, naturally with the event being held in Norway, this makes it particularly interesting. So, as many of you know, we'll touch upon in a second, really. I mean, the Norway has got a particularly high uptake of electric vehicles and of course associated infrastructure to support that. So it really does make it especially interesting. I think as a general theme of the conference, there was certainly an acknowledgement really that this is, this electric vehicle revolution is happening now. This isn't really like a future state and an aspirational future state. This is very much, in play right now in many of the major automotive markets, and that this transition is now taking place. There was certainly a theme around, the fact that, I guess more widely, societally, we have to do more with less. Talking about energy utilization generally and thinking about, how we use our vehicles, how we get around. There is really as a society, a requirement to do more with less. I think a bit of an acknowledgement, but maybe, it is a critical theme that democratization of the EV revolution is something that needs to take place. This can't just be something that happens in affluent countries where consumers can afford to make the transition and can afford the cost of a Tesla or a Polestar or a Porsche Taycan, etc. That we have to find a way to make sure this is a priority for everyone in the world, not just a few percent of people. The topic of charging infrastructure, of course, is huge. It's more broadly one of the major obstacles to electric vehicle adoption, and no surprise that this was a huge topic at the conference. Many of the sessions on the charging infrastructure topics were very busy, and the one that I presented in on charging infrastructure was indeed that. I think framing the framing the conference also was the recent announcement of the EU Commission that effectively the legislation has passed that after 2035 there'll be no more sales of anything that are not light passenger vehicles that are fully electric. I think obviously this was celebrated by the attendees at the conference. I think many feel and stated that actually we'll probably get there quicker than that in Europe. There's definitely a concern around redundant assets and the fact that, would anyone really want to go and buy an internal combustion engine vehicle in 2034 for fear of what it would be worth, in the years to come. So yeah, certainly a thought that, obviously this is good news for the EV industry and let's say for wider society. In principle, this is for the European society, this is a good thing. And obviously there's interim targets on the way to that 100% by 2035.
Okay.
So yeah, very much an EV focus. I would say a few of the participants who presented gave relatively short shrift to fuel cell, even comparatively for medium heavy duty commercial vehicles. Lots of talk at the event around how we can electrify the medium heavy duty commercial vehicle fleet, because of course this is lagging light passenger vehicle quite considerably, even in markets like Norway. And of course, associated infrastructure, etc., needs to be put in place to support that. But, I think one of the themes around that is certainly around, we can't really wait and hope that fuel cell will help us electrify the medium heavy duty commercial fleet. We have to crack on now with battery technology. So super interesting.
Yeah, sure. It definitely sounds it. So the EV story around Norway is quite well understood, as we all know, with lots of lucrative incentives have really driven the market adoption of EVs. So did you learn anything else during the visit about the EV environment in Norway?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really fascinating. It's my first chance to visit Norway, my first time in Oslo. So, to get to see it in action, if you like, was really interesting, and have conversations with people who've been part of it. So, I mean, so far this year, as I understood it, the uptake of plug-in electric vehicles in Norway stands at 79%. So plug-in hybrid and fully battery electric so far this year is 79%. And really, there's probably something of a stigma around not buying an EV now in Norway. It's almost kind of common sense to buy an EV, and that came across in conversations with various people. That said, we talk about EV sales, but we should also talk about EV park. And what we mean by park with a C is the size of the fleet, the vehicles in operation, if you like. So even in Norway, with their very high level of EV adoption, we still only see 17.4% of the vehicle park in Norway that has moved over to EV. So in that context, still a lot to be done. I was having an interesting chat with a member of the Norwegian EV Association, and he told me an interesting statistic that I think it was in a recent month in 2022, there were more Porsche Taycans sold in Norway than there were diesels combined for light passenger vehicle, which I think is an astonishing statistic that tells you a lot about not just the shift away from diesel, but also, I suppose, the affluence of some of the consumers. But certainly in the presentations from the Norwegian folks, there was definitely an acknowledgement there's much more to do with vans and medium heavy commercial vehicles. So in terms of the park associated with vans and buses, that's only 3% that is electric. And then of the heavy commercial vehicle fleet, only 0.2%. So really that shows the scale of the challenge in order to electrify a greater percentage of the transportation fleet. I think one of the other things that came across was, originally this kind of EV revolution in Norway really started predominantly in Oslo. So, obviously that's where the majority of Norway's population is, but it's also probably where the majority of the money is as well. And I mean, compare that 17.4% of the Norwegian vehicle park being EV. In Oslo, this is around 40%. So literally, as you wander around Oslo, it's quite apparent that around 4 in 10 cars that you see is electric. So it's very present. It's very, there's a lot of charging infrastructure on street corners. A lot of people in Teslas, and probably one of the biggest things I noticed was just how quiet the city is. Of course, it's not the biggest of urban capitals, not the biggest capital city in Europe by any means, but even during busy rush hour traffic, the city is so much quieter than many comparable cities. And of course, it feels very clean. The air feels clean. It's really quite noticeable as someone coming from London, that's far from the worst city, but certainly it's very apparent. I think one of the other points that came up in conversation was the fact that in Norway, in certain regions, even as far, the furthest north region now, they have over 50% uptake of electric vehicles. So a lot of these kind of common industry issues that have been cited around, okay, you can't run an EV if the temperature is really low, that's kind of been put to bed really. If people in the far north of Norway, in cities like Tromsø, can drive an EV, then certainly people in Michigan or in Canada can drive an EV. And I think in one of the lessons learned from the infrastructure perspective, in terms of this mishmash between public investment and private investment in the infrastructure, I think one of the clever things that Norway really did was the public funding, they acknowledged that some of the state-driven funding had to go there to put infrastructure in place further north, where, okay, it's not going to get very well used. It's probably not going to be that profitable just because of the sheer lack of people there. But at the same time, it had to be put there in order to encourage adoption. And now it has been put there. It has encouraged 50% plus adoption in these more sparse regions. I think one of the other questions I had for a guy who I was chatting to from the Norwegian EV Association was, obviously people know that the vast majority of electricity in Norway comes from hydroelectric power. So of course it's renewable power. This strategy of hydroelectric power long predates EV rollout. They've long since had a view on the importance of clean energy independence. Some of these hydroelectric stations were put in place over almost 100 years ago now. So I think that it's EV has been a natural transition as a result of that. But of course, they've had a very forward-looking vision on clean energy, certainly, despite the fact, of course, conversely, that they have made a huge amount of money from exporting oil and gas, especially gas. So probably one of the other things I would say, it was announced there that in terms of the EV subsidy, at the moment there is a kind of unlimited, any vehicle you buy, regardless of list price, you get a certain subsidy. However, they're soon to implement a 50,000 euro limit in terms of that, the support that you get in terms of subsidy. That's not to say that if you buy a vehicle over 50,000 euros that you won't get a subsidy. You effectively get subsidy up to 50,000 euros of the list price. So it's still quite lucrative, and not necessarily, excluding people who buy more high performance expensive vehicles. But I think they have had to acknowledge the fact that this needs to start, being more directly targeted to people at the lower end of the economic spectrum. And then probably the final comment I would say, electrification is pretty well integrated in Oslo. I used an e-scooter to get around quite a bit. There's specific lanes for that. It's been integrated into the transport ecosystem in the city, and therefore it felt pretty safe, to be honest. It was it wasn't really a huge concern of kind of chaotic oncoming traffic. It felt very orderly and very safe. So yeah, really interesting city, and adapting to the world of electrification in a very inspirational way, I would say.
Nice, yeah. And I must admit, I'd love to have seen you on an e-scooter around the city of Oslo.
Yeah, I got caught in a pretty nasty downpour at one point, and I was wearing my conference suit, and was looking a bit bedraggled when I got back to the hotel. So
oh dear. Cool. Okay, so can you discuss the content of some of the other keynote presenters or speakers?
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, so in the main plenary session, lots of interesting presentations being made by some quite senior folks, and this was kind of aside from the more technical tracks, some of the more academic papers being presented in the separate conference sessions. So it's a big presence from Freya, the So for those of you who don't know, Freya, Luxembourg headquartered, but fundamentally Norwegian battery cell manufacturer, not off the ground yet, but at the same time in the process of scaling up. They are looking to be in the manufacture, not just cells, but also the active material within the cells. And they're working in conjunction with the company 24M, who are effectively delivering the manufacturing process. So, history being they're a company that successfully went through the SPAC process when SPACs were perhaps all the rage in the financial markets, the last sort of 12, 24 months. It was 2019, I think, that the SPAC went through, and they raised around 870 million US dollars in order to scale up their operation. So I would say very successful raise, and significant investment from a number of major players. People like Glencore have invested very heavily in them. So they're, in terms of just shedding a bit more light on their scale up process, that they're going to go into stationary energy storage first, go into market in 2024, and then initially focusing on electric mobility in terms of buses, and then into the automotive market to follow. Of course, perhaps one of the questions people might ask is, well, we've got lots of other battery tier ones who are perhaps already in the market, already well placed. What's the unique selling point of Freya? Well, of course, they're going to do this in Norway. They're going to do the active material manufacture in Norway. They're going to do the cell manufacture in Norway, and of course, with that hydroelectric power, they have a clean source of power, and therefore carbon neutrality is very easy or comparatively easy to achieve and justify. They also mentioned that they think, around 9 terawatt hours of battery capacity is going to be needed by 2030 across all domains. So straddling, consumer electronics, medium heavy duty, stationary energy storage, as well as light passenger vehicle. And they forecast a relatively large amount of that for medium heavy duty commercial vehicles. If we're going to electrify that fleet, we're looking at batteries somewhere between, maybe 200 kilowatt hour and 600 kilowatt hour, maybe, for long distance stuff. So a lot of batteries required, and Freya is very much bringing and so focused on the chemistry LFP, so lithium iron phosphate batteries. They're going to bring the lithium and a lot of the raw material from Chile straight to Europe, in partnership with the processing company Alines. So in a way, you look at the way in which a lot of these raw materials are being moved around the world at the moment, often going from Africa to China for processing, then back to Europe, or, onto Korea, etc. The idea that they would, minimize this journey, reduce the extent of the supply chain by bringing the material straight from Chile to Norway for processing, cuts out a large amount of the carbon emissions along the way. So in terms of companies looking perhaps to partner with someone with an obvious carbon neutral strategy, that this will be their unique selling point. With the event being in Scandinavia, there's a heavy presence from Polestar. Obviously, they are the performance electric vehicle arm of Volvo, and therefore the Geely group. And I think one of the interesting things about Polestar is, they've said it publicly, but they are aiming to be the first, fully circular electric vehicle brand. So from if you like, from conception to recycling, they are hoping to achieve full circularity in that process and be carbon neutral. And a number of Polestar vehicles on the Ride and Drive events and very visible around Oslo, to be honest, already. Many of the Polestar 2s, so Polestar 1 being the very high performance, very expensive two-door EV, but then the 4-door Polestar 2, which is kind of like the Tesla Model 3 rival, is already very popular around Oslo. Interesting presentation from Daimler, very keen to outline their electrification strategy and the fact that they hope to have an electric alternative of every model available by 2025. Bit more detail outlined specifically on their battery plan. So they expect that 90% of the electric vehicles that they produce will be on a common battery platform. And this will be very much a modular battery platform, which will allow them to offer, if you like, different battery capacities on different vehicles with different underpinnings. Talked a bit about solid state batteries, that they are They are partnering with the company Factorial and Prologium in the development of solid-state batteries, and there was also separately later an interesting announcement from a colleague at Prologium around when they expect to be going to market. I think it's around 2024 that they expect they'll have solid-state batteries for light passenger vehicles. So an interesting and ambitious timeline. Daimler also mentioned that on silicon anodes, they are working with the company Sila Nanotech, and they expect the first application of these silicon anodes to be featured in the electric version of the G-Class, the G-Wagon, and they expect that to be sometime mid-decade, so around 2025. They also shared some interesting information on the motor side. So many of you might be aware that not that long ago, Daimler effectively bought the company YASA, the UK-based motor manufacturer of axial flux motors, and effectively they've shared the fact that they expect that for most conventional battery electric vehicles, they'll feature an in-house developed e-axle. But for the AMG, the high performance variants, they expect these will be effectively, offer that higher performance with the use of the YASA axial flux. So this partnership, this integration of the YASA technology into the Mercedes portfolio is taking place and will be seen in some of the AMG variants. A couple of other interesting presentations to mention. There was a delegation there from New Zealand, certainly looking to imitate and learn a lot from the Norway model, and lots of synergies, of course, in terms of natural environment and similar size of country, similar type of population in many ways. And actually, interestingly, New Zealand's had a very kind of rapid adoption of electric vehicles, 8% in 2021, and actually 20% so far this year. So certainly if you compare it to Australia, relatively next door, they're moving much faster. And actually what they're really looking for is to continue this huge uptake in the short term, they actually need more OEMs to come. They need more EV industry to come to New Zealand in order to help support the rapid adoption of electric vehicles. So it's interesting objectives, interesting model. They've also set some very aggressive CO2 targets. So, if you like, the most aggressive globally by 2027. So they're looking for light passenger vehicles to average 63 grams per kilometre by 2027. And for medium heavy duty commercial vehicles, this will be 87 grams per kilometre by 2027. So yeah, it would be, that will put them in a kind of industry leading position, of course, a comparatively small country in the global context, but certainly setting some very ambitious objectives to reduce CO2 and have a cleaner vehicle fleet. And final point I'll make, we on Auto Tech Insight, or within the scope of the supply chain technology team, we don't talk about heavy duty trucks that much, but I think it was certainly a very interesting conference in terms of how people are trying to support the electrification of heavy trucks. The colleagues who were there from CARB, the California Air Resources Board, they outlined the advanced clean truck regulations that are coming in. So some ambitious attempts in California to move to increasingly electrified trucks. Probably one of the most interesting announcements at the event was around the charging infrastructure standard for medium heavy duty. So the company Char-In are very much central to the development of the standards, and they announced that. Many of you will be familiar with the CCS standard, which is commonplace in Europe. So Char-In have been working on the development of the MCS standard for medium heavy duty commercial vehicles. The upper power limit on CCS has been certified at 450 kilowatts. The highest power that we expect to see from MCS is 3,750 kilowatts. So super high power, and obviously, we need this super high power in order to be able to charge these batteries that can be up to 600 kilowatt hours. And obviously, this has a lot of implications in terms of usability and handling of the plug, etc. We're talking about a voltage of around, 1,250 volts, 3,000 amps. So, significant safety requirements, significant need to define a very robust standard. And one of the first things the first companies to adhere to this standard has been ABB. They were presented with a certificate to say they're the first company to conform to that. And we now have an SAE standard, J3271, which supports MCS. So the trucks that will come to market will have both a CCS and an MCS plug. They expect that the CCS plug with that 450 kilowatt kind of power level should be fine for depot charging. Obviously, the great thing about trucks is that they operate on very predictable routes typically. So actually the idea of installing charging infrastructure and thinking about where it needs to be is perhaps a simpler question to answer than it is for light passenger vehicles, when people do all sorts of different things, take all sorts of different routes and have all sorts of uses of their vehicles. There's a separate presentation from a Canadian company that were looking to demonstrate, in terms of the cost benefit of installing depot charging for trucks and buses. As they mentioned, predictable routes, but at the same time, installing this very high power level is hugely expensive. So actually, it makes a lot more sense to have multiple depots with multiple charging opportunities and try to charge at a lower power where the vehicles will dwell, and not have the need to either charge individual vehicles very quickly or charge many vehicles simultaneously. So they presented a case study where different methods were picked, different example situations were tested, and came up with some different kind of cost benefit analysis of how this charging infrastructure should be installed for fleet operators. And again, just to touch on a point around fuel cell, really, there was an interesting panel that was held, on the Freya stand with a number of representatives from OEMs, light passenger vehicle OEMs, as well as medium heavy duty commercial OEMs, and really they talked about the idea of fuel cell technology as the liberator of the battery, not necessarily the nemesis of the battery, and an acknowledgement that we need both, especially for long haul. But at the same time, there is this danger, this fear perhaps, that hydrogen will be too late and too expensive, and that it might end up being kind of like the Betamax of the auto industry. And certainly, I think there is a danger of that. It's something that we reflect a relatively modest uptake of hydrogen fuel cell vehicles in our forecast. It's not to say that they're not necessarily good or not viable, and but it may well be just a case that they're too late. And then, probably the final point, people often, was an interesting question posed about, what is the most critical battery metric in the scope of the discussions there? If you could pick one parameter, what is the most critical parameter? And the analogy was kind of made with a lottery ticket, really. If you have one number on the lottery out of 6, if you've got, I don't know, high DC charging capability in your battery, or if you've got high energy density on your battery, you've only got one of the 6 lottery numbers and you win nothing, right? Actually, what you need is all 6 lottery numbers, or you need a large number of you need many of the 6 in order to win a prize, right? You need a number of these attributes in terms of, energy density, specific energy, charging performance, reliability, safety, etc., in order to have a battery that will do well in the commercial environment. That was a long answer, sorry.
No, that's no problem. It sounds like there's some really interesting discussions happening. So that's great.
Absolutely.
And you did mention that you were presenting at EVS35. Can you tell us a little bit more about the SCT paper, the research and its findings?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we presented in the charging track of the conference. Yeah, I was lucky to present on behalf of the work that Claudia Vittori and Darshat Parikh and the team have done. So, if you like, bringing together some new insights. So our recently launched EV charging infrastructure forecasts for the charging infrastructure itself. We presented a paper that brought together both the new forecast on the infrastructure side, and then the vehicle side information within our power electronics offering, and really just an explanation of our methodology. Right, I think it's always important that we justify when we develop a forward-looking forecast how do we do it, how do we build it. So explaining the multitude of inputs that we include in our forecast, so things like the consumer perceptions, some of the macroeconomic inputs, robust actuals on how many charging stations are there in the markets already, and then of course using that to build upon how many charging stations and what type we expect to be in the market in different geographies. So on the vehicle side information, presenting our views on battery technology, average battery capacity, how that influences charging infrastructure demand. And then probably an interesting theme of the conference, really, around, onboard charger performance and the facility or the opportunity to have bidirectional charging and if you like, EVs to provide a bit back to the grid where required, or reduce the reliance on what they might call peak shaving. The idea that we don't have big spikes in the grid and many EVs charging at the same time, or the idea that that we can support peaks and troughs in demand with bidirectional charging. So some interesting debate on that. We presented our view, and also the progression of DC fast charging performance and how we expect this will evolve on the vehicle. On the infrastructure side in the paper, we presented like our cumulative figures, how we expect cumulative charging to be, the numbers to be by major region. We've kind of in the methodology settled on a kind of a figure around 30 vehicles per charger in the public domain as, broadly speaking, a good figure. There was a similar presentation given from some colleagues working in the Norwegian EV Association that kind of broadly were in agreement with this, that they started off with a higher number than that, and it's slowly kind of come down to somewhere in the realm of 30 vehicles per charger. So that gave us a level of confidence that the modeling and the methodology is pretty solid. And then probably one of the other, the other points to make from our numbers is, we in Europe specifically, of the kind of 30 European nations geographically, we think that around 90% of the stations in the forecast are going to be in 12 European countries. So that point earlier on about democratizing the EV uptake and ensuring that everyone can kind of buy into this transition, it does raise questions, certainly. What about those other 18 European nations where there might not be enough charging infrastructure to support a decent uptake of electric vehicles? This could really compromise, whether Europe can meet its net zero aspirations and objectives further down the track. And yeah, some interesting debate, questions and discussion following the presentation. So it was a good honour and a privilege to present.
Yeah, that sounds great. And I know how hard Claudio and the team have been working on this, so it must have felt good to finally go out and showcase that.
Absolutely, I kind of took the champagne, I would say. The hard work has been done by those guys, but happy to share the good work of the team in the public domain. Sure.
Okay, and so Graham, I do know you quite well, and I know that you are not an EV driver as of yet. Did you see anything in Oslo that made you consider changing your mind?
Absolutely, yeah. So secrets out. Yeah, I'm not an EV adopter as yet, but certainly, plenty to make me, potentially reconsider my decision or my next move. I would say, it's a super inspiring place, and I think that the breadth of achievements in Oslo and Norway more widely is certainly impressive, and I think it's, the something of a stigma to attend a conference like that, as I say, and speak to people and then say, oh no, I don't drive an EV. So absolutely, it's it's a very valid point. But at the same time, if I explain my use case, I mean, I live here in London. In principle, I commute to work on the bus. In principle, I shouldn't even own a car, right? I guess as some of these kind of car sharing models start to emerge, it will be infinitely more sensible and financially lucrative for me to hire a car, and should look to hire an EV. I actually spoke to someone who was in similar circumstances to me, who does exactly that. He doesn't own a car, but he hires a Tesla Model S when he needs to drive to his home in the I think it was his family in the north of Scotland. So I think that I'm in that group, and should certainly reconsider for that reason. I think one of the things that came across as well, though, is quite clear that some of the early Norwegian adopters were very tolerant. They put up with poor range, they put up with lack of charging infrastructure, but the kind of the moral imperative around it was very clear. The number of people who kind of said, that they're doing this for their children, they're not necessarily doing it for themselves, they're doing it because they think it's the right thing to do. That was very clear, like a very kind of principled attitude that I think we can certainly learn from. The multiple concerns around charging infrastructure remain. They're quite tangible for me. I'm fortunate to live on a street where there are a couple of EV chargers, and I would say the vast majority of my use could be well covered by an electric vehicle. And I think that it's only really those long distance trips, which unfortunately I make quite a few times a year, that would pose a challenge. But I think obviously, some discussions around the fact that maybe we do just fundamentally need to change our behavior. We need to accept the fact that this is more important to do this than it is to spend 20 minutes charging rather than 3 minutes to refuel. Is that a compromise worth making for the bigger picture? So it's a very interesting and valid point. I think more broadly, one of the concepts that came up and got me thinking at the event, we saw a really interesting presentation on Hyperloop, which is something that many of you will know that Tesla have championed quite a few years ago. I think back in 2013 was when Elon Musk announced the Boring Company, and there was an interesting presentation from a Dutch team who had effectively won the Elon Musk sponsored competition to develop the vehicle that would feature in the Hyperloop. And some interesting progress in terms of moving this along. And this is basically the idea that you could travel at extremely high speeds between certain locations, let's say around Europe, in what is effectively an enclosed train, but at super high speeds, because there's no physical connection. It's done through magnetic levitation, etc. So this concept is moving along. Obviously, this is further down the track, but it would certainly give some thought to how we all move around and what's the best way for us to move around. I think really the main thing that I would say around EV adoption, and for my EV adoption, is the purchase and the lease cost is still a hugely significant undertaking for many people, and actually the relatively small second-hand market of good quality long-range electric vehicles isn't really there yet. They haven't really come down in price enough. There's very high demand, and obviously some of those early electric vehicles that perhaps even didn't have particularly great range to start with are the ones that have most issues with battery life and longevity of the battery. So I think for me personally, there remains a concern around that. But obviously the second-hand market is going to swell relatively quickly. So that's probably my thoughts on the matter. I think that maybe it's time to change. But that's all I would say. I mean, maybe just to finally, to conclude, really, the next EVS event is to be held in Sacramento, in California next year. I think similar time of year, around June. So probably another interesting conference to attend to see how another market that is an early adopter of electric vehicles and a fast-moving electric vehicle market is, how they're doing it there, and obviously what's a much more densely populated part of the world.
Okay, great. That's brilliant. And sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot there regarding your car, but
no, absolutely fine.
It's a good talking point at the very least. That's great, thank you. So unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. A big thank you to Graham for joining Autology and sharing your insights.
Thank you, Rebecca. You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you listeners for tuning in as well. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode at our autology@ihsmarket.com email. And you can find out much more at autotechinsight.ihsmarket.com. Don't forget to hit all of the subscribe, follow and like buttons to stay on track with the latest Autology podcasts. And we look forward to you joining us again next week. Bye for now and have a great day.